So we'll just maybe wait another minute or so for people to come through. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Buckley Program's 11th annual conference taking place virtually this year, the theme of which is God and Man at Yale at 70 Years. My name is Pat Punyagupta, and I'm a member of the Buckley Program Student Board, and I will be moderating today's event. I am also delighted to welcome you all to the first panel of 5 panels of this week, which will focus on religion and education in America. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley Program. So the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 350 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation of and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, www.buckleyprogram.com. Now, on to our guests for today. Ross Staudat joined the New York Times as an opinion columnist in April 2009. His column appears every Tuesday and Sunday. He is the author of The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery, which was published in October 2021. His other books include To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, published in 2018, as well as Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, published in 2012. He is also the film critic for the National Review. Gabrielle Girgis is a postdoctoral fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She recently completed her doctorate in politics at Princeton University with concentrations in political theory and public law. Her dissertation on religion's special protection under American law was nominated in 2020 by Princeton's Politics Department for a Distinguished Dissertation Award, and she has written and published on religious liberty topics for conferences, academic journals, and other popular venues. Matthew Schmitz is senior editor of First Things and a contributing editor at the American Conservative. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Spectator, the Catholic Herald, and other publications. He holds an AB in English from Princeton University. So regarding the format of today's event, our panelists will first each deliver their opening remarks. Then you, the panelists, will have an opportunity to exchange thoughts, elaborate on points that you had made in your opening remarks, and respond to one another. And after that, I will ask a few questions we've prepared in advance. We'll also move on to some audience questions, which the audience can submit through the event, throughout the event, using the Q&A function, which is on the lower panel of the Zoom window. And we will wrap up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And so with that, please join me in virtually welcoming our guests to Yale and to the Buckley Program. And with that, I think, Ross, you may begin.
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. Thanks to my co-panelists for joining. I want to say for the record that although this is a virtual event and panel, unlike my co-panelists, I'm actually in New Haven. Indeed, I'm in a badly lit attic less than a mile from Yale itself. So I feel like that should lend my words a little extra weight in the course of this discussion. I'm sure it will. Geographical proximity is everything. I want to try and offer, I guess, a sort of maybe not particularly provocative, but somewhat provocative way of looking at the evolution of the modern university and the position of its conservative critics over the 70 years since God and Man at Yale was published. The book itself was published in certain ways at the moment at which the modern secular university, which is to most of us who sort of come of age in its shadow simply is the university, was really fully coming into being. And you can see this as sort of a long process of the retreat of Christianity and confessional loyalty in higher education, and the advance of a straightforwardly technocratic and scientistic spirit focused on the production of useful knowledge. The idea in particular at the time that Buckley was writing that the modern university was in service to some combination of the aims of the United States government and the aims of an emerging world civilization. And the sense that this coexisted with a kind of spirit of small L liberalism insofar as it had any kind of effect on the humanities programs that were themselves somewhat cast into the shadow by technocracy and the focus on science. So if you look at this history, it's basically the history of running, the history of the James Conant era, the Clark Kerr era, the idea of the multiversity that was sort of a popular is the wrong word, an intellectual's way of describing this transformation by the early 1960s. And in this world, as you can see if you go back and read what Buckley was actually writing, conservatives were often not the defenders per se of sort of free inquiry and free expression and debate on college campuses. In many cases, they were defenders of an older perspective on the university, in which universities existed under some kind of moral or religious or philosophical umbrella that was supposed to guide the research and especially the education that went on therein. And at the time of Buckley's writing, it was still possible to at least remember what this mostly Protestant vision looked like, even if it was fading rapidly. And it was still possible to see it at work in the Catholic collegiate system of the middle of the 20th century. Within 20 or 30 years, certainly by the time we reached the era in which I and my young, more youthful looking co-panelists came of age, even the sort of Catholic model had been largely consigned to history, and most important Catholic colleges and universities in the United States, with some eccentric exceptions, saw themselves as pursuing a version of the secular university, the secular multiversity, with some Catholic framing and Catholic language sort of informing those projects, informing that technocracy, but not really defining, to say nothing of controlling it. And in the course of that transformation, I think conservative critics of the university have sort of moved back and forth, have been in sort of patterns of uncertainty about what exactly it is that they are critiquing in this new system. Because at the same time, really at the same moment that this project sort of came to full fruition, it developed this really strong critique of itself from the left, which became, sort of emerged strongly in the 1960s, basically in the space between the Port Huron Statement and the era of maximal campus protest. And this sort of more left-wing spirit initially sometimes cast itself as sort of fulfilling the liberal project more fully. The arguments of this free speech movement in Berkeley, the arguments for sexual liberation on college campuses were sort of couched in terms of sort of fulfilling and completing the liberalization of the university. But at the same time, in a mode that eventually became much more powerful on the left, you had a different kind of moral critique of this project, which said, that it was that the sort of modern technocratic university was too subservient to the American defense establishment or American capitalism, or these forces that were seen as malign from the left. And over subsequent decades, the that left-wing critique sort of waxed and waned. It had various peaks, peaking at one point in the late 60s and early 70s, again in what we remember as sort of the peak of the PC political correctness wars in the 1980s and early 1990s, in each case sort of receding and letting the more secular and technocratic spirit come back to the fore. And so that by the time I got to college in the late 1990s and early 2000s and found myself, in the sort of arrogant style of young writers writing a book about it, it seemed at that moment like the technocratic spirit was likely to sort of effectively prevail, that it could in effect sort of coexist with this left-wing critique, but constantly sort of channel it effectively, co-opt it into, let's say, a kind of Ben and Jerry's style left-wing politics, where you have this sort of moralistic rhetoric around, but everyone understands that the real business here is consulting investment banks, doing hard science, and embodying sort of the spirit of technological modernity. And I think where we are now, 20 years later, it's much more of an open question whether that's true, because especially over the last 20, but especially in the last 5 years, that left-wing critique has advanced really remarkably and dramatically, and obviously has spread well beyond college campuses to inform, inform the various forces that the left wants invade against, like, corporate America, Silicon Valley, things associated with capitalist projects now increasingly speak the language of the campus left. But on campuses themselves, I think, and this is I suppose the provocation, you could make the argument that we have completed, that the wheel has come full circle, or it's coming full circle at least. And from its, mostly Protestant and somewhat Catholic past, the modern university has sort of returned to a confessional system where you can do hard science in the modern university, but your grant making proposals had better be written in the language of, respect for the Holy Trinity, or respect for a different set of metaphysical principles. And again, I think you can argue about how complete that is, but I think that at least is the transformation that has sort of been happening on elite campuses. And it means that to be a dissenter from that sort of emergent moral and metaphysical orthodoxies of the left is increasingly puts conservative and some liberal students and faculty in the position of being, shall we say, a dissenting Protestant attending a very high church Anglican university in the 19th century. Or a non-Christian student attending a religious university in a more contemporary era, or any era for that matter. And that, I think, has various interesting implications. I'm not quite sure what all of them are for how students and faculty in those positions ought to think about their place on college campuses. And, then there's also sort of the open question of where conservatives, who are as excluded as ever from the sort of high level life of the modern university, to what extent should they sort of embrace the logic of the transformation and say, this was fated all along. What we are seeing in the triumph of the left is the fundamental weakness of a secular and technocratic model of education, versus to what extent should they throw in their lot with the remaining defenders of that secular and technocratic education on the theory that, even if there is a deeper spiritual kinship between, let's say, religious conservatives and awoken leftists, in practice, religious conservatives are more likely to find a comfortable home on a college campus run by technocrats than they are by diversity-minded bureaucrats. So those I think are at least some questions raised by the current moment. There's more I can say, but I think that maybe is a useful introduction and provocation for thinking about the issues we're talking about today. So I'll leave off there.
Great, thank you very much. And I think, Gabrielle, you're up next.
Thank you so much to the Buckley Program for allowing me to join this panel. I'm really excited to talk with you today. And I will say my remarks are going to be a little bit more formal than Ross's, only because I have a number of points I want to make, and I think they'll come across more clearly, but I'm happy to elaborate in a more informal way in the Q&A. So given the topic of our panel and the broader theme of this conference, God and Man at Yale at 70, I'm going to talk briefly today about some current legal and cultural trends of thinking about religion and education. And I'm going to make 3 points. First, as a launching point, I'm going to discuss an upcoming religious liberty case at the Supreme Court, in which oral arguments are going to be heard this week, actually on Wednesday. And that case asks whether parents in the state of Maine can use publicly funded tuition assistance to send their children to religious schools. The big question at issue in that case, I'll explain, is about whether the state can withhold public benefits from religious activities. Second, I'm going to argue that some of the proposed answers to that question reflect a broader shift in the academy and the culture at large in how we understand religion itself. That is to say, and here's where I think my remarks will tie more closely to some of the things that Ross and Matt are going to introduce us to. We increasingly see religion today as a matter of self-definition. It's primarily a question of living out our personal identity, which is in contrast to an older and more robust understanding of religion as the practice of orienting one's life towards something outside and greater than the self. Indeed, something that's the very ground of our existence. And third, I'm going to suggest some practical implications of this shift in our understanding of religion by drawing a little bit on my own past experience as a religious graduate student in an elite secular university. So first, let me zoom into the court's upcoming case this week, Carson versus Macon. In Maine, which some of you will know is a largely rural state, not every school district has its own public high school. So the state government has set up a plan for its secondary education in which school districts that don't have a public high school can either contract with another district to send its students to their high school instead, or alternatively, parents can receive money directly from the state, taxpayer funding, to send their children to a school of their choice, a private school. Since 1980, though, Maine has not allowed parents to use that funding to send their children to religious or sectarian schools. And now a number of parents in Maine are challenging that rule as a violation of their free exercise of religion. Without digging too much further into the legal weeds of this case, I think it's fair to say that it's going to confront head-on a question that's been left open by a couple of other similar cases recently decided by the court. And in the first of those, some of these you may be familiar with, Trinity Lutheran, the court said that Missouri couldn't exclude a Lutheran church-affiliated school from public funds for playground resurfacing. And in the second, Espinoza, the court drew on its earlier decision in Trinity Lutheran to argue that Montana couldn't refuse parents a tax credit for donating to a scholarship fund if their donation went to a religious school. And in both cases, what's interesting is that the court decided that the state had wrongly excluded people and institutions from eligibility for public benefits just in virtue of their religious identity or status. But one possible implication of this reasoning, though, which lower courts have picked up on, is that the state might be able to refuse to give public benefits that will have a religious use or purpose. And at least one of the liberal justices, Justice Kagan, has signaled that she would favor this reasoning. Whether the reasoning stands is, as I said, the central question at issue in Carson. The tuition assistance these parents are seeking will clearly have a religious use or purpose because it's going to fund a religious education for high school students. It would be misleading, obviously, to say that Maine is just discriminating against the religious identity of the parents in this case. So the question will be, does it violate the free exercise clause of the Constitution for Maine to prevent families from using vouchers to attend religious schools? Now that question, to move to my second point, isn't just an intramural debate of interest to people who've already graduated from college, but I think what we would call the status use distinction in Carson that I've just talked about, I would suggest actually reflects a growing divide in the academy and the culture and how we think about religion in the first place. And that is to say that I think there are two different kinds of unspoken premises about religion that inform our sharpest disagreements on religious liberty, not only at the court, but in the university and the public square too. I've seen this quite clearly through my own work on religious liberty. About a year and a half ago, I finished a dissertation that I'm now hoping to turn into a book on the unique importance of religion and its need for special legal protection. And that project was motivated by what I found to be a kind of striking phenomenon. And that was a kind of across the board gospel consensus in my field, which is political theory, that religion is not something that requires special protection or accommodation at all. To take just one indicator of that, nearly every book on religious freedom that's been published by Harvard University Press in the last 10 to 15 years argues that the law shouldn't grant more extensive exemptions for religion than for many other deep commitments in a pluralist society. And the question that got my thinking started was why? To answer that, I began to read all the sources very closely between the lines. And what I found was that nearly every mainstream, that is, when I say that, I mean every journal article, every book that's been published by a top academic press or journal and appeared on class syllabi, every mainstream form of skepticism about special protection for religion today begins from this assumption that religion at its core is nothing more than a way to shape and live out your personal identity, your sense of self. But there are lots of ways to live out your identity. Indeed, you could say that's one of the most important questions in politics today, which identities require cultural and legal affirmation. And so there's really no good justification for privileging religion over other identity commitments. I think this modern, you could even say postmodern view of religion is in contrast to a much older, classically rooted idea that religion is a good, different in kind from other goods. What distinguishes religion on that view is that it's not primarily about the self. It's about ordering and allowing your whole life to unfold in union with something that's not just outside of you, but the ground and source of life itself. And lest people listening think that in saying this, I'm just condensing the diversity of religion into Judeo-Christian monotheism, I will tell you that as part of my research, I've discovered pretty good sociological evidence that this is the way most religious people across Eastern and Western traditions today understand their practices. And on a view like this one, religion is something that needs different treatment. So I'm not talking now about whether religion deserves special treatment, but whether it requires it, than other commitments people hold in liberal plural societies like the one that we have. And that's because religion doesn't collapse into beliefs about who we are that can be accepted or rejected by the majority. Religion is something that naturally unfolds into public practice, practiced beyond the four walls of the home and the church, the mosque, or the synagogue. Everything that the religious person does can be understood as a form of cooperation with that external objective source of meaning. We can't reduce religion to identity or status. It's about conduct. And that would suggest, to tie back what I've said to the earlier comments on the court case, that if it's wrong for the state to discriminate based on religious identity, as it said in Trinity Lutheran and Espinoza, then it should be wrong to discriminate based on religious conduct too. And that's something that the court could decide in Carson. To clarify, I just want to suggest really quickly that on this more classical view of religion that I'm articulating in contrast to the more modern one of religion as a form of identity commitment, I'm not trying to suggest that every action that could possibly be motivated by religion demands an exemption or an accommodation. But I just want to say instead that the more that we think of religion today as purely a matter of identity or sort of self-shaping, the harder it becomes to see the point of accommodating people's acting on religious convictions in the public square, in business, in education, adoption, or healthcare. And I think it also becomes easier to say that while policies that target religious identity are bad, policies that target religious conduct, say the religious use of public funds, are okay. Because when the demands of your identity conflict with the affirming of other identities in public, then why should we accommodate or make room for them? So to sum up, I think there's a lot of work to be done in evening out our conversation about religious freedom today, not just in the Supreme Court and the academy, but in the culture too. And the modern view of religion needs to hear its older counterpoint in version 2.0, to echo some of what Ross was saying about the need for a broader conversation between conservatives and technocrats, or the woke and left. Of course, at most Western universities and liberal arts colleges today, I think people who might find that older view of religion more compelling are very much in the minority. And that brings me just to my final comments about some of the practical interpersonal consequences of this shift. I just want to say something briefly, not about God and man at Yale, but God and women at Princeton, if you will. And at Princeton, the liberal philosopher John Rawls is held in high esteem. But I want to say that for me, as a Catholic and for the most part politically conservative student, Rawls played a very different role than he did for most everyone else. He was a kind of gadfly for me. And that's because he famously argued that it's unfair to justify any law or policy from the perspective of religion or any other what he would call comprehensive doctrine. But in conversations that I had with classmates and advisors at Princeton, a common refrain I would hear against my developing idea that religion does require kind of different or special treatment and protection is that this kind of support or this view could only be grounded in theological or sectarian premises, and those can't possibly support legal and political decisions. And I think, just to wrap up, it's hard to overstate the power and the hold of that view still on the way that students are taught to think about the influence of religion on public life today in their college and university classes. I think students of faith are very quickly made to feel on the defensive if they try to defend political views, particularly traditional or conservative ones that clearly flow out of their religious beliefs. And so the goal of my work then is just twofold. It's first to explain why it actually makes sense to approach the question of religious exemptions from the religious person's point of view, that is, from the perspective of people who actually do religion. And second, I think it's important to show that this point of view is not actually hopelessly theological or sectarian, but intelligible, rational, something we can disagree about across the spectrum of atheism to devout faith. And articulating that perspective is really important, as I've tried to suggest, because I think right now it's either underrepresented in public debates about religious liberty or just not there at all. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll be hearing from Matthew next.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be speaking before the Buckley Program here today, and especially to be speaking with Ross Stafford and Gabby Girgis, both of whom I've known and really admired for some time. I still remember as a young man, reading Ross's writings on the Atlantic back when there was this thing called blogging, and just loving what he did and following him ever since. And I recall meeting Gabby many years ago, I think at a Princeton reunions, actually, might have been when we met. And it's just been wonderful to see your work develop, and I'm delighted that you're now at EPPC, contributing to their work there. So today I want to talk a bit about the kind of phrase "for God, for country, and for Yale." I think that's how it goes. I'm not a Yaley, so and I think it's useful to just stick to to fix on those terms, because they distill three overlapping loyalties that once would have been characteristic, notionally, of the American elites. A religious piety, however indefinite, a national loyalty, often expressed not just through sentiment, but through military service, and then loyalty to your alma mater, which, given that it's Yale, I'm going to understand as basically a class loyalty. So you have God, country, class. And what we've seen, I think, progressively occur, not just at Yale, but at many elite institutions is a shedding of, first the religious loyalty, in its explicit and confessional form. You have the end of mandatory chapel attendance. You have the broadening of admissions to encompass Jews and Catholics. I remember when I was an undergraduate at Princeton encountering a very ancient and very liberal Catholic man who talked to me just briefly in passing about when he was a student at Princeton and how there were, I think, 2 other Catholics he knew on campus. And to think just about how much the university has changed, and so many other universities have changed in that time. And I think we often kind of think of religious exclusiveness as something that was characteristic of private schools, which often had denominational identities, but this was often true as well of public institutions. I'm from Nebraska, and if you read newspaper archives, you can find these dispiriting accounts of the reception that Notre Dame's football team would receive when it would play at the University of Nebraska, which understood itself really as a Protestant school. And during halftime, they would do like anti-papal kind of skits on the field to stick it to the mix. And so there would be Catholic institutions, public institutions would often be implicitly Protestant. So there was a much stronger sense of confessional identity, and that began to fall away. And then subsequent to that, I think you have national identity beginning to fall away. When I was at Princeton between 2004 and 2008, there was still just a tiny bit of the afterglow of 9/11 left, just the smallest bit. A memorial had gone up to campus to the victims of 9/11. And so there was still a tiny bit of that patriotism to which so much of the country rallied at that time, but it was already beginning to fade away and to be displaced by something else, a strong belief that being a responsible citizen and a good person meant opposing expressions of nationalism or of patriotism that might seem at all chauvinistic or exclusive. I remember either my junior or senior year doing pickups for my eating club. And an eating club, at least this one, is an exclusive social club. And it has a process of selection. Some people get in, some people get out. And then you go pick up the ones who get in. And one of our club members objected to the fact that certain members of the club, while we were going around campus picking up members who had been admitted to this club, she objected to the fact that some members of the club were chanting USA, USA. The club was not an American club, but chanting USA is just a way for young men who have had some beer to express high spirits, or at least it was at that time. And so she said, should we really be chanting that? And I thought that was quite striking, because there we were standing at Princeton in the social club, which has explicit process of social inclusion and exclusion. And we took very seriously, all of us, including myself at the time, the issue of whether or not it was proper to chant USA, lest someone feel left out. And so, in terms of the Yale motto, you've seen over the last, let's say, 100 years, the dropping away of for God and for country. And then last year I saw on a scarf, a silk scarf my wife owns. She studied English at Yale. It's a kind of Yale scarf, and I think it was printed by the Yale Alumni Association or something. And I saw this legend on it and it says ... and for Yale. ... and for Yale. So that's what was written. And for God and for country had just fallen away. So I think it's worth kind of asking, what it means when these things fall away. What, are we, has the institution become more inclusive, more exclusive? Are those the terms to think in? What is gained, what is lost? To continue in the mode of anecdote, this summer I visited Oxford and a friend was taking me through some of the colleges, and he pointed out to me on some plaques, commemorating the war dead from World War I for a certain college, that in recent years, several of the college's German alumni who had fought and died in World War I were added to the plaques because there were Germans studying in Oxford, at the beginning of the 20th century. Some went back and fought for Germany against the men that they sat at table with. And I was very, very moved to see that. I think that's obviously touching, but it also reflects, a change in the mentality of our elite institutions. And this is, kind of the, I think this brings into focus, at least one question. What does it mean for society when its leading institutions understand themselves in opposition to religion and in opposition to the nation? I think that you have to look at those things side by side in this case, just because the objection to the two, I think, from many members of our elite are similar. If you have either a religious loyalty or a national loyalty, that risks carrying you to excesses of exclusion. It risks leaving some people out, and so they've tried to think of themselves as transcending those things. But what remains, I would say, the real risk our institutions face is that they are now unshackled from any countervailing force or cross-cutting principle that might mitigate their tendency to serve the interests of a particular class. So the university that is only for Yale, Yale is only for Yale. That is worse than Yale is for God and country. It's worse in my judgment, even if the God that Yale has once served was an exclusive God who had disowned his mother and didn't care for Catholics. It's a Yale that is only for Yale and not also for country is worse than a Yale that's for a country, even if that country sometimes enters into ill-advised wars. So I think it should be a subject of real concern and self-reflection on the part of people in these universities that they are declaring independence from any religious tradition or national loyalty. And it should also be a concern for people outside these universities. And I think that for conservatives or for religious people, that's going to be where the action is. And I think they need to take what's happening in the university very seriously. And they need to take seriously the university as a force opposed to their interests and interested in marginalizing them. So, perhaps, God and Man at Yale, will be remembered as, a book that might as well have been titled, kind of God and Man at Sodom. It's a kind of description of this place that is going to need to be greatly weakened or burned away if justice is going to come to this country, if there's going to be some mitigation of the class and cultural conflicts that are besetting this country. I think that the Trump administration had some sense that Yale needed to be restrained, Yale and all of its fellows. And that's why you saw things like a beginning very modest tax on endowments, things like an investigation of Chinese funding of American research and sealing of American research. An investigation that turned out that Yale hadn't been reporting the money it was getting from China for about 4 years. And also an investigation of Princeton for racism, since its president declared that it was a racist institution. I think that that kind of conflict between the the political, between basically the political community and the university is likely to intensify, and that religious people are very often going to be siding with the political authority against the university, simply because the university increasingly excludes them. So I don't know if Trump will manage to go as far, Trump and his acolytes will manage to go as far in their war on the university as Henry VIII did in his war on the monasteries. Certainly one hopes that the means used are more humane. But if Trump and his successors manage to destroy our universities, I'm not sure that it would be bad for the country. And it might actually beautify our landscape. When you think of the wonder of the ruins of the abbeys and monasteries in England and the great romantic poetry that those ruins inspired, maybe America could begin to seem like a more ancient, beautiful, and textured society if people could wander through the ruins of Princeton or Yale at night. And over in this corner there's a couple doing something, and over here there's a raccoon scrounging around. So I think that might be my vision of a somewhat more just America, one that doesn't have the ivies, where the ivy grows more freely. But if we're going to avoid that, probably these universities need to figure out how to avoid being so openly in conflict with both the nation and religion, neither of which is about to go away.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think now we're just going to move to, we're just going to have, we're going to give an opportunity for the panelists to respond to one another or elaborate on a point that you've made previously, or a point that one of the other two panelists made that you think is noteworthy or would like to respond to. We'd also like to remind the audience that the Q&A function is open. So if you would like to submit a question, please feel free to do so there. And so with that, if anyone has any thoughts, this is supposed to be a sort of free discussion. So please feel free to air them and voice them.
Well, I'll offer something just in the spirit of sort of getting at potential mild differences between our presentations. I was struck both by Gabby's discussion of the long shadow of John Rawls over academic life, and Matthew's discussion of the sort of globalization and the sort of post-national, post-religious university. Struck by them because they comported with my own academic experience. I was at Harvard during 9/11, so I was there for that sort of brief spasm of national feeling that Matthew describes, and it was quite real and extremely temporary for all kinds of reasons. But my sense now is that sort of Rawlsian liberalism and a certain kind of sort of the globalization of the consultant class, right, are weaker forces on college campuses than they were 10 years ago. And that the stronger force, we can debate how strong it is, but the stronger force is a more sort of explicitly ideological progressivism that was relatively weak in the Harvard of circa 2000, 2001. And to the extent that the left was potent on campus in those days, it was more focused explicitly on class issues than on the issues of identity that Gabby was talking about a bit. So I'm just curious how either of you guys think that people who are critical of Rawlsian liberalism and, consultant class globalists should think about the shift to the extent that they are those ideas are defeated or tamed. Like if you read, Rawls's, the whole idea behind Rawls' thought, right, is to ground a universal ethics in secular commitments. And I think the idea that there is a universal ethic grounded in secular commitments is not in vogue on college campuses right now. Or at the very least, the idea is that any universal ethics needs to be understood by prioritizing identity and the experience of oppressed groups as the lens through which you understand it. Certainly not the idea that you can somehow stand outside of human existence behind a veil of ignorance and assess what the just society looks like. So yeah, I'm curious if my co-panelists agree about that shift, and if they do, to what extent they think it changes at all the attitudes of religious conservatives, small L liberals towards and these are obviously different groups, towards the state of campus life.
Sure, I'll jump right in. Those are great comments, and I have a number of things I would want to say in response, not necessarily connected, but I should preface what I say by noting that I was an undergraduate 10 years ago, and I finished at Princeton a year ago. So I in some ways, I think I've kind of overlapped with that period of the increase or concentration of ideological progressivism that you've talked about, Ross. So I don't know that, and I will say that towards the end of that time, I was actually working remotely from Princeton, so I wasn't even fully on campus enough to appreciate the kind of shift that you're talking about. But I guess I wouldn't want the main thrust of my presentation to be misunderstood as mainly a diagnosis of Rawls still has a long shadow. And I think that may still be true. It'd be interesting to hear maybe from some of the students who might be listening on their own experience of whether, in classrooms, they still feel like they encounter the kind of old, don't impose your moral views on me, in, defending a particular viewpoint. But the main point I was trying to make was actually a much more, I think, kind of, if you want to call it postmodern claim that the way that people understand religion, that these older views that we may have had that may have been stronger and more influential when we were all in college has very much been supplanted by this idea of religion, with religion in particular, that it's just understood as one of many kind of different identities that are shifting and negotiable all the time and at war with each other. Okay, so that's one thought. The other big thing I wanted to say was that I didn't speak at all about this, but I went to Notre Dame for my undergraduate education, and I'm now back there because my husband is teaching in the law school, and I'm doing some work for one of the centers on campus. But it's been interesting to see. It's really interesting to think about Notre Dame in the way that you suggested we might understand Catholic universities today, as kind of straddling this. Are we a little bit behind the curve of secular universities in still adhering to the sort of modern technocratic spirit of the university? I mean, when I think of Notre Dame moving in this direction, I think of the Land O'Lakes Conference in the 1960s, in which Father Hesburgh, famously wanted Notre Dame to basically get on the same track so that it could be like another Princeton or Yale. And there's always been this kind of undercurrent of resistance to that idea, with the thought that Notre Dame will never be one of those kinds of schools, and it should be very much trying to do its own thing, kind of under that older moral vision or umbrella that you were talking about. But one recent episode that I've witnessed at Notre Dame that I think to me really embodies this kind of weird straddling that you're talking about is there's been this intra-campus paper debate in between the more conservative student publication and the more liberal one. The more conservative student publication recently published an editorial that was critiquing the university's handling of LGBTQ questions and challenges as inconsistent, like that there's been no real clear message from the school on, is there a kind of uniquely Catholic way of kind of compassionately, but also clearly addressing the issues. And for that fairly gentle editorial, the student who wrote that was completely shut down. I mean, if you want to say canceled across campus, I mean, there were, for her one editorial, there were probably 7 in the Maine newspaper that were strongly, in very emotive terms, responding to her argument. And all over social media, which I think that's another thing too, is even just looking back to 10 years ago, the prevalence of social media as a way to quickly and not very informed, in a very informed way, engage on these issues is new. But she was, called all sorts of names, and it's one way in which I think Notre Dame is kind of shifting in the direction of maybe getting more in line with the woke left. I don't know how you'd put it, but anyway, just a variety of thoughts. But thanks for.
Yeah, Ross, I think raises a good point that this a certain kind of technocratic kind of globalist outlook has receded as something maybe kind of something certainly more kind of obsessed with American history has arisen. Wokeism that is very interested in our racial agonies. And does want to talk a lot about the country and what matters there. And I think that and it also has a strong religious character. The woke stuff, as many critics are eager to point out. I think that's a great point. Sometimes I will see on right-wing blogs someone reporting the latest provocative statements offered by Don L. Padilla, a man who was an undergraduate at Princeton at the same time that I was, and is now a professor in the classics department. There's a long New York Times profile of him talking about whatever, deconstructing the classics, or making it less white, something like that. But the recent comment of his that got a lot of attention was his statement that he wanted to tear down Princeton. And conservatives were pretty disturbed by this. And I thought it just filled me with a really, really deep ambivalence, because I absolutely disagree with Don L. Padilla, but I share I think many of his feelings about the university, and it might be worth conservatives thinking about their attitudes, conservatives and religious people thinking about their attitudes toward the university in relation to those from critics like Padilla. Padilla was, I think they called them dreamers, but he was brought to the U.S. as a child, and he was an illegal alien or undocumented migrant or whatever it is. Then he enrolled at Princeton, and he ended up being naturalized. He was incredibly gifted. He's from the Bronx. He was advanced quickly and was able to proceed quickly because of his immense gifts. The university was very good to him, but he was, at the end of this kind of chain of glittering achievements, he's been left with a really, really deep well of resentment toward the institution that seems to have done so much for him. And so it would be easy to just accuse him of ingratitude. But I think before conservatives do that, they should think about him next to someone like, say, J.D. Vance, who's now running for Senate in Ohio and recently attracted attention for saying professors are the enemy, quoting Richard Nixon. And J.D. Vance, like Don L. Padilla, was treated very well in many ways by an elite institution, Yale, where he attended law school, and he received mentorship from professors, just as Don L. Padilla did. But J.D. Vance feels a great clearly a great deal of resentment toward Yale, even as he's clearly closely attached to it. Obviously, Don El Padilla is very attached to Princeton. He says he wants to tear it down, but it's his employer. He's made it his life. Could he actually go back and live in the Bronx? As someone from Nebraska, small town, rural, religious Nebraska, who went to Princeton, I'm doubtful that Padilla could go back to the Bronx any more than I would probably want to return to my hometown. So what is it about these institutions that is creating so much opposition and people who seem to be very opposed politically? It might have to do with the limits of the meritocratic project and just the difficulty of bringing people in from the periphery to the center very quickly. We don't live in a society where you can read just reading a biography of Metternich, and it began with really genealogy of his family, how they slowly ascended over the course of centuries through service to king and church. Well, it doesn't take centuries to ascend in America. You can occasionally. There's not a lot of social mobility, but sometimes you can just go from nothing to being professor at Princeton, the most distinguished professor at Princeton. You can go from being a hillbilly to being a hillbilly elegist to possibly being a senator from Ohio, and maybe that rapid ascent just induces vertigo. But I'll just stop musing here and say it's probably worth conservatives thinking that someone like Padilla is not all wrong, but is maybe he's probably all wrong, but also half right in some way, or shares certain if not critiques, at least resentments, and it might be worth thinking about his experience to understand our own.
Great. We'll now be moving on to the question and answer portion. And so the first question concerns a common thread that has been running through all three speeches more broadly, which is one that concerns institutional decay and the abandonment of a more classical traditional view of religion in favor of what perhaps in favor of, say, a technocratic orthodoxy, or religion as an identity shaping institution. Clearly, there are a myriad of factors that have contributed to this decay and to this shift in perspective. So according to your research, what exactly would you say has been the contributing factor to this shift in the way that elite institutions view religion? And in understanding these causes, what can conservatives in the modern day learn from the history of this shift? There's no particular order, so if one has thoughts, you do feel free to respond.
Do you want to go ahead, Ross?
It's an incredibly complicated story. How many hours do you have? You can see that there's a variety of things going on at once, right? You have in just in the American context, a certain kind of crisis of Protestant faith in the aftermath of the Civil War, reflecting various intellectual trends, the influence of Darwinism, the fact of the Civil War itself, which was essentially a kind of intra-Protestant religious war that, like the religious wars of the 17th century, bred a certain kind of skepticism in its wake. So you have that dynamic that very slowly, in fits and starts, works its way out in American life across decades. Joined to a trend where, in effect, sort of the achievements of science proceeding by leaps and bounds lend the scientific side of the university project this kind of increased and skyrocketing credibility that throws sort of the traditional humanities into the shade. And so the traditional humanities are trying to sort of ground themselves, even as ideologically the kind of religious ground of a humane education is slipping away. So you end up increasingly in the 20th century with a sort of humanities grounded in a kind of cult of art, right? This sort of, this art as a substitute for religion effectively becomes very powerful for a while. And then that sort of gives way itself in the second part of the 20th century. And there's, a more politicized view of what the humanities are for. So by the time Alan Bloom gets around to writing Closing of the American Mind, there really isn't any position for religion in the university. The question is, what is in the driver's seat? Is it this sort of ever more politicized humanities, or is it this ever more technocratic and secular sort of science and business and so on apparatus? And one of Bloom's insights was that these things sort of work together, right? That if you look at sort of certain styles of deconstruction and literary criticism, there's sort of an attempt to import the categories of science into the humanities in order to lend them to steal some credibility from the sciences. You certainly see that happening in social science, right? And then you have critics like W.H. Auden has his poem that says, thou shalt not commit a social science. That's his advice for humanists. But anyway, this is just me rambling on what is just a very, very long and complicated story. But one piece of that story that I think is particularly important for religious people today is to see that, there's this post-Civil War shift, this sort of crisis of Protestantism that works its way out. But then there is also just a deep shift that happens in the 60s, where prior to the sexual revolution and those transformations, there, is this certain place that is sort of sustained and maintained by a kind of Reinhold Niebuhrian Protestantism in the academy. And that seems to go away after the 60s. And even though, even when the scientific and technocratic spirit is challenged, as it was in the 60s and is again by the left in the present, almost nobody in the intelligentsia turns back to traditional religion. You can see that, to Gabby's point about Notre Dame, right? You could say, if you were a Catholic school, you could say, oh, look at this moment where you have, this sort of resurgence of interest in moralism and sort of moral accounts of the university, this kind of revolt against meritocracy and technocracy. Well, now is the time to plant the flag again for Catholic education and for the Catholic version of that. But if you tried to do that, the reaction from the students would not be, or from professors, at last, we will re-embrace Catholic moralism. The embrace is no, the reaction is, what are you talking about? That's reactionary and homophobic and bigoted and patriarchal. If we want moralism and metaphysics, we have to look to the left for it. And that, that's not true everywhere, but that is the pattern, right? That something has happened to make it really hard for the intelligentsia to ever go back to Western monotheism or biblical religion in even the limited way that a lot of the intelligentsia did after World War II in that brief religious revival. And figuring out why that is a pretty important challenge for religious intellectuals, I would say.
Yeah, I'll just build on what Ross said. I would very much agree with what he said, and it's a variation on what I was going to offer as an answer. I certainly think that within my own narrow field of political theory, it's just generally true that I think the main the majority of the books and articles that I was talking about, that are suggesting or are built on this kind of assumption that religion is just a form of identity, are generally written by people who have no faith or who don't profess any particular religious tradition, or perhaps they do, but it's a very liberal strand of it. And so it's not clear whether there is necessarily a belief in anything transcendent beyond personal identity. And so if that is the view that you have, then I think it's very obvious that you would naturally see, you would have this sort of outsider perspective on people who are religious. You would not believe that there was anything objective or external there. And so you would think that the best way to explain the point of religion from that perspective is just some sort of kind of self-fulfillment and like professing certain beliefs and like being aligned with them or something. So, I mean, as far as like what conservatives can take from that, I mean, I think the most important thing is just always to realize, even in a time where it feels like, sort of like Ross said, like we've moved away from the kind of debate between like Rawlsian liberalism and like classical liberalism or something. It's like we're no longer in like, I would think like the world of my advisor, Robbie George, like we're just in a different place in terms of the way we even think about whether we can have arguments or disagreements in rational terms. But I think despite being at that point, it's very important for students now to realize that every view that people profess on these questions, like, or, even their skepticism about religion or whether like religion should have some sort of broader place in the university and in public life comes from starting premises. Like that's just how we operate. And it's just very important to be able to trace those back, because when you do that, then you actually know like where you really stand with respect to one of your peers, and what you really fundamentally disagree about, beyond just the immediate practical conclusion that might spark debate. So, yeah.
I think in terms of religion in the university, it's worth understanding that religion can be a justification for the exercise of authority. The association between priesthood and kingship is universal and ancient, and so it's quite interesting that our elites are not eager to claim religion as a basis of their authority. And I think it says something about the type of leadership that they are offering. It's technocratic, obviously. It's managerial in form. It draws its justification not from religious authority or loyalty to a particular place or people or the glories of some historical tradition, but from the results that it offers, and that's I think that was the kind of the technocratic moment in the university. And as Ross has alluded to a couple times, it's maybe now shifted more toward a slightly less bloodless conception of what it means to be a leader of our society, and we're now getting somewhat more somewhat bolder notions of leadership means serving justice. But though the character of that belief has changed and it's become kind of more religious in sociological terms, it remains just very, very opposed to religion as such, and that that fascinates me. I would certainly tend to read the kind of anti-religious character of our elite as being as corresponding in some way to the actual nature of our elites. The types of jobs they have, the sorts of organizations that they're in. It probably reflects the fact that they're members of the professional managerial class. They're tied to these institutions that don't derive their legitimacy from the transmission of wealth through families, or don't derive their legitimacy from kind of serving the nation through the military or something. And so it's just quite interesting to see an elite kind of cut off religion and patriotism as two ready justifications. I mean, even Soviet Russia at times found a need to call upon religious piety and nationalism. So I kind of think that those things are going to come back in some form in our society too.
I mean, I would just point out, to sort of pick up on the point about the managerial class, that yes, most elites belong to that class, but the university itself has developed within itself this kind of more, shall one say, ministerial or priestly class over the last couple decades, who are working, they're obviously not members, they're not graduates of seminaries, but the growth of the sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy has created a kind of feedback loop where you have ever-growing numbers of jobs that are not the sort of go work for McKinsey kind of jobs that dominated the pre-professional landscape when I was an undergraduate, but are jobs that are essentially about a kind of, I won't say theological but at the very least ideological sort of scrutiny and enforcement. And I don't know how sustainable that pattern is, in part because, for the reasons Matthew suggests, it still isn't grounded in, it doesn't connect upward to God, and with certain exceptions, it isn't particularly grounded in, traditional small c sources of loyalty to country, family, or the institution itself. But it is very powerful. I mean, Yale, since we're talking about Yale, rather famously, it was just reported, has as many administrators as it does undergraduates, right? Was that the statistic? Which is just an extraordinary thing, right? To think about that. And that clearly, again, I'm uncertain how it cashes out, but it clearly is playing some version of the role that the Protestant clerisy played historically. Anyway, that's
I think I agree with Ross, but I would like to respond in the form of disagreement to keep things interesting.
Yes, you should.
I mean, these are not kind of obvious. I mean, I agree they are taking on a sort of priestly function or dogmatic function, but I would say they're certainly members of the managerial class, in that they are managers. They are managing basically behavioral issues or HR issues, and you could see them as very much a part of the managerial revolution described by Burnham, where the surplus of capital ceases going to the kind of nominal owners of the capital and starts going to the managers of the capital. So Yale has just a bafflingly large endowment. Obviously, it's not going to trustees or professors or people who seem like more classic custodians of the university, but instead is going to the people who operate the university, because neither the trustees nor the professors want to operate the university, and they both ceased to do so a long time ago, and instead began to hand work over to administrators. Obviously, some of them are professors, but those it's a different track, and they're called administrators for a reason. So there's I think one way to look at the woke stuff and all of these ideological commissars is just who's controlling the capital. They're going to take its surplus, they're going to hand it out to their friends and their networks, and more of it's going to be siphoned off by these people.
Great, thank you. And I think the last time I checked, there were actually more administrators than undergraduates. So that's pretty bleak. But I think,
except for the administrators, I mean, not bleak for them.
Definitely not. So I think the next question that I want to ask is, given what we've been talking about so far, what are some, and despite how bleak things look, what are some of the concrete ways that non-sectarian universities can be more open to the classic understanding of religion? Are sectarian institutions the only solution? Like, must we resort to the Benedict option? What exactly are the options that are available to us as of 2021?
Gabby, since you are have the closest connection to actual universities of any of us, I think you should give us the answer.
I don't know if I have the answer, but I guess just in very small practical ways is usually the solution for these giant problems, right? But I think one thing I really struggled with, and again, came out of this graduate program like really recently, is just the kind of resistance in the classroom and in conversations with advisors, just across the board, just total skepticism of the idea that if you favor a kind of robust role for religion, like period, whether it's in like university and the culture more broadly, publicly, that always comes from a kind of sectarian background, and that there's no kind of rationally intelligible to people who don't share your religious beliefs way of approaching the issues. And so I think, again, this is something that like none of us are necessarily in a position to do anything about, but it just like I would want there to be more of a cultivation of open-mindedness among the professors who are often leading seminars and advising students, that there would be an effort to kind of break down this very entrenched starting assumption or viewpoint. And yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. There was one other thing, but it's slipped my mind. So if I remember it, I'll suggest it. But if Ross or Matt have anything to say, they can.
Yeah, I think that, obviously, there'll be a variety of options taken by various people. I do think that we'll see kind of new forms of religious discrimination, or what can be seen in those terms, emerge at the university. I think the university can be a very inhospitable place for Jews who are maybe excessively orthodox in their belief, so to speak, or excessively attached to the nation of Israel. Both of which are probably viewed with some suspicion on the contemporary campus. And I think that other kinds of more dogmatic believers will also find themselves increasingly isolated and on these campuses. It's possible that the alienation between the elite university and religious belief will be kind of blessing in disguise for religious communities. Someone I know told me that back in the day, Regis High School, a selective Jesuit school here in New York where I work, used to refuse to write recommendations for its students to attend non-Catholic universities. So if you wanted to go to Columbia, your teachers at Regis would not write a recommendation for you to attend Columbia. You had to go to Georgetown if you were good, or Fordham if you weren't. And it's possible that we'll see more kind of self-confidence of that type coming from religious groups. And when that happens, you might get a somewhat more diversified American elite. If you have, more Americans who are, say, attending a Hillsdale or a Thomas Aquinas College, maybe they will have slightly different obsessions than people who are attending Princeton. As I say this, I'm losing all optimism. Never mind, there's no upside.
I mean, I've written about this a little bit, but I'm a partisan of the idea that we should have new colleges and universities in the U.S. I think it is one of the challenges of what we're discussing here has been, not just sort of the particular problems of Yale University, but the homogenization of elite schools and the fact that, with Catholic schools being a prime example, but not the only example at all, there's just this sort of race to imitation. And so if you have a sort of ideological worldview that sort of takes over 5 schools, it probably takes over all of them, right? And so I don't think you have to, to answer in certain ways a question I raised earlier, I don't think you have to necessarily choose between the idea that, the answer to the problems in the universities is a recommitment to classical liberalism or a revival of religious traditionalism. This is a country of 300 million people with a lot of private fortunes out there. You should be able to have more confessional colleges founded and, some attempts like what they imagine doing with, the University of Austin startup of sort of small L liberal antidotes to progressive uniformity. You should be able to try both and do both, right? And there's a lot of obstacles to that, and obviously, it doesn't. If you're inside one of these institutions, you have to find ways to sort of build community and create intellectual community there. But I do think the country would be a real sign of recovered American dynamism if there were, more schools being founded or reinvented even, a school that sort of, one thing that's going to happen is that a lot of mid-size and smallish liberal arts colleges especially are going to be really challenged by the declining enrollment of students over the next 15 or 20 years, driven by falling birth rates and also probably the decline of foreign student admissions in the post-COVID era. And, if I was running one of those existing schools, I would take, the problem of progressive orthodoxy in higher education as an opportunity to rebrand and create your own distinct identity to sort of save yourself from that general decline. So it doesn't have to be new startups. It can be reinvention of existing schools. But I think both are more likely to be key solutions than anything that happens internally at Yale in the next 10 years or so.
Can I jump in and say one other thing? Actually, so I think one point that Ross's comments are raising kind of implicitly is there remains this question of, I guess to go back to the original question, Pat, that you posed of, how are students who, manage to find themselves in elite secular institutions today, how are they to understand sort of their goals or their vocation, like in that kind of school, if there is no longer a kind of overarching classical view of religion or like morality that's like there informing their mission at that school. And I think, I've thought about this a little bit with respect to Notre Dame in particular, because I would say that Notre Dame has very much lost much of the strong Catholic character and identity that originally motivated its founding. And I've thought that the best thing you could say to a current student at Notre Dame who's serious about their Catholicism and wants that to shape, what they do going forward and their education is to really just take advantage of the credential that you're given at a school that is more and more secular and is losing its religious character just to benefit from that alone and kind of making your way in the world, but to nevertheless, when you no longer have a kind of handed to you from above plan that the school gives you for like, this is how you're going to get like a really informed classical education, for example, you kind of have to carve it out for yourself. And so I think that something analogous would be true for a place like Yale or Princeton. Like there just isn't a kind of necessarily a template anymore that's passed down. So it's much more student driven. It needs to be. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, we do have around 7 minutes left, so this may have to be our final question of the day. But so this question concerns not just educational institutions, but the debate surrounding contemporary debates surrounding religion more broadly. So as anti-religious attacks have intensified or as institutions become more hostile towards religiosity, many conservatives have reacted by espousing absolutist views of religious liberty, which can at times have the unintended effect of undermining the case of religion. And so how can we best promote an approach to thinking about religion within both educational institutions and society more broadly that charitably recognizes, say, limits to religious freedom and also is also suited to discourse with individuals of opposing viewpoints?
So my own simple sense of these matters is that it's going to take a consensus to beat a consensus. And so while I fully support people who are seeking academic freedom against oppressive kind of false orthodoxies, and I'm happy to, and there is a proper freedom for academic inquiry. There's a proper freedom of religion. I do think we would be very foolish to imagine that by simply invoking freedom or neutrality or procedures that we can unhorse an overbearing false orthodoxy. What we'll probably need is some to work our way toward, however hesitatingly and through however many invocations of freedom, work our way toward a different countervailing orthodoxy that is truer and more humane.
Yeah, I mean, I think just even more briefly that this is not only true of religion, that in general, there is a tendency among critics of current progressivism to make free speech arguments that are not likely to carry the day unless they are accompanied by explanations of why the arguments that are being suppressed are not only allowable, but are in some cases true. And so, in the end, I have a lot of appreciation for, the sort of civil libertarian absolutists. Maybe I have more appreciation for them, maybe in the last few years as they've become rarer than I used to. But at the same time, in the end, for ideas, for sort of the free play of ideas to really happen, you need people to believe in those ideas and defend them. So it doesn't even have to go all the way to a kind of sort of a truer orthodoxy, as Matthew suggests, though it might. But at the very least, you need people saying, well, the reason that we should have religious arguments in a philosophy department is not for the sake of the religious liberty of the students, but because those arguments might be true. That has to be part of the defense. Like I do think, like, to the extent that a healthy classical liberalism exists, it exists as much in the power of contending factions, sort of as it does in some sort of supervening view that we're committed to free play of ideas in the abstract. You have to have people committed to the ideas to have that free play happen.
Yeah, I would echo what Ross and Matt both said. And I mean, on the particular, I'm not sure if you're referring in part to there's kind of a Catholic strain of arguments that's more hostile to religious freedom and integralism. And so I mean, my thought on those perspectives has always been that there's something very dangerous to the actual good of religious faith itself in the general view that for Catholics in particular, that there's should be a more kind of coercive understanding of the range of freedom we have to live out our religion. And so, sort of like Ross was saying, like the truth of religion itself is important enough that there need to be the adequate preconditions of freedom to realize it for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So
we went, you realize we went on, an extended period of time in this debate, 1 hour conversation, 1 hour and 29 minutes before someone used the word integralism. And we had almost made it all the way through, but Gabby, you yeah, anyway, just pointing that out.
Well, fantastic. Well, we do have just 1 minute left, so I think it's best to wrap things up now. But thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking the time to join us in the Buckley program today. We really, really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for the very, very salient and fruitful points that you all made. So thank you so much. If anyone has any final thoughts. If not, then I think we can wrap it up now. So thank you everyone very much for coming. And we do have 4 more panels remaining this week on a variety of topics related to the conference theme. So we highly encourage all attendees to check those out too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. This was a lot of
Thank
fun.
you so
Thank you.
much. Take care.